Over the past 5 weeks or so, I've had the opportunity to try both the Nikon Z8 and the Sony A1 Mark II side by side. And I'll be honest with you, if you clicked on this video, you're probably wondering what those two cameras are like, and I'm going to spoil some of it ahead. They're neck and neck. And the reason why I'm stuck between these two, and if you clicked on this thumbnail, you've probably seen the title, I need to choose one, right? It's because I've sold my own gear, and if you're interested in why I've sold my Fujifilm gear, it's in one of the corners, and I'll pop it in the description below. But before we begin talking about these two, I just want to give a heads up. First of all, thanks to both camera companies, Nikon as well as Sony, for giving me the opportunity to try these two amazing cameras. No money exchanged hands, not affiliated with either of them. In reality, I've decided that I want to choose one of the two flagships. I need a perfect all-rounder. I'm fairly new to professional photography and video, and this is now my full-time job, and so I need something that's more reliable, and I've narrowed it down to these two cameras. So just for starters, not a sponsored review. This is my opinion, and your mileage may vary, but thanks in advance for sort of clicking on this video and jumping into this discussion with me. Okay, let's quickly just sort of summarize what the two cameras are known for. The Nikon is a real DSLR-sized, huge body. It's a really chunky camera. It has buttons for everything. It has multiple function buttons on the front as well. Very comfortable and very, might I say, photography focused. So everything is there at your fingertips. You don't need to sort of go into menus. Seldom do you find yourself in a situation where something is not already at your fingertips. The Sony is a hybrid body, and it's sort of evolved step by step over the past 10 years into what it is. It also has sort of function buttons that you can customize, and overall it's a true hybrid camera body. In terms of shutter, I think the Nikon Z9 and Z8 are truly groundbreaking cameras in the fact that they don't have a mechanical shutter. They have an electronic shutter only, which has a 3.7 millisecond readout for photography, and depending on the settings, you get 4.9 to 14.9 thanks to Gerald Undone. Now we know this. It has around 14.9 millisecond readout speed in certain situations when you switch on oversampling. With photography, 45.7 megapixels, separate AI chip, really capable system on the Nikon, 50.1 megapixels on the Sony, but the Sony does have a mechanical shutter, and at certain situations, we'll find out in the pictures, a mechanical shutter can come in handy. Physically, the only other major difference that I'd highlight is that Sony now implemented the screen that we all know from the A7R5 and A9 III, so the 4-axis tilting screen can actually fully articulate. I'm looking at it right now as I'm filming myself. I don't need to set up a control monitor. I can just look at the different data, and I can see that I'm constantly in focus and that my eye is right there. On the Nikon, with the exception of this, everything else is there. It has a really good, vivid, bright display that slightly looks larger, but actually is around the same size as the Sony, and it can tilt sideways as well as up and down, but it will not fully articulate. So that's also something, if you are planning on filming yourself in certain locations, just something to keep in mind with Nikon and Sony. So the way I've set up the Nikon was really good. I got this from a YouTube video as well. I had one focus selected as standard, and then I had 3 buttons to toggle 3 different modes, like single point autofocus, zone, tracking, 3D tracking, and I could just toggle those if and when needed. So if there was a situation where all of a sudden there were 5 subjects in the frame, I could quickly just switch over to single point autofocus and job done. So photography wise, that was the first thing that I noticed, is it is almost impossible to miss a shot with Nikon. Humongous sort of history that they have with photography. I don't think that there's a situation where a Nikon camera, especially a Z8 or Z9, will not get the job done for you. With Sony, most of the zones that you have for autofocus are, good enough. It's just if and when you choose one of them, is it the right situation? Sony can be a little bit too sticky for my liking. So if you have subject detection on, just be prepared. If it picks out a sports player, it might stick with it even if that person is now running out of the frame, which can be good and which can be bad. Of course, it can be customized, but yeah, that's also something that I noticed with the Sony. The Nikon just jumps from one player to another as you point around, almost to the level of the eye autofocus we see on the new Canon cameras as well. So it's almost witchcraft level on the Nikon. When it comes to frame rates, it's a bit more of a mixed bag on both sides. On the Nikon, you get 20 frames a second, completely compromise-free JPEG and RAW, full-size 45.7 megapixels. You also have a 30 and 120 frames a second, but those are JPEG only. And the size of the files also change, I think, to 20 and 11 megapixels. So if that's enough for the publication that you need to hand over, then great. If not, then you're still there with 20 FPS, and it is 20 FPS, no compromise whatsoever. On the Sony, you have basically three scenarios. You have the mechanical shutter, which isn't often mentioned, is 10 frames a second. So you have even crop body like Fujifilm cameras that can do faster than that, but it's 10 frames a second, 50 megapixels. You also have 20 FPS, which is electronic shutter, and that is uncompressed RAW and JPEG extra fine, full bore, go at it. And if you need 30 frames a second, it's also there, and you can even use the new C5 custom button to trigger 30 FPS, no matter what your base rate is set to, but it is compressed RAW. In any of the compressed RAW methods, you can get 30 FPS, but uncompressed, it will stick to 20 FPS, even if it says it's set to 30 FPS. So just remember that if you are weighing up your options. Pre-capture is available on both of them up to 1 second, with the exception, and this is a point to Sony, that they do JPEG and RAW for pre-capture. On the Nikon, it is JPEG only. Now, I often find myself in scenarios where auto white balance is something that I need to rely on. I need to run between an indoor venue, run outside and make an interview. I don't really have the time to be setting up before, because sometimes we arrive and we need to be rolling as we step out of the car. So we don't really have the opportunity to use a gray card and set up a custom white balance. You can do it from memory, but you don't know what sort of lights are indoors. But it is worth mentioning that Sony comes with a 18% gray sensor cap, so that's always with you, usually when you go around, and you can always fix things if you have a moment. But overall, they're both good. I tend to keep auto white balance with white preference on both of them, and then you can work your way in post-production and fix those things if you need to. The color science is more neutral on the Nikon. Sony still has its own punchy colors and often brown, magenta hues that we know them for, and the blues are quite often saturated. But what I did notice is that there is a difference between photo and video. And whereas Sony can produce the same colors across photo and video, in my findings, there are completely different colors when it comes to N-Log or N-RAW, as well as the photo modes on the Nikon. So photography-wise, I'll be honest, when you need to hand over something between periods or halftime and you're a sports journalist, Nikon is going to be the way to go, because those files are almost completely ready by the time you import them. You do your little adjustments, copy-paste the settings, and you can send them out to an editor. On the Sony, you'll need to probably work a little bit more, or you need to set up a workflow where somebody edits it on the other side immediately upon receipt. So that's just something that the Sony, unfortunately, I think they still need to work on. They've come a long way with their new processor, especially since the A7R5. But it is something to keep in mind. If you need to deliver something within minutes and you don't have an editor on the other side, that's something to keep in mind. Nikon is probably going to be a better choice there. All right, let's look at the actual files, and I'll try and keep it short for the sake of this video. Concert photography, right? So my first concern was any sort of a banding, because the Nikon setup has no mechanical shutter, and I know this venue and I know how terrible the lights can be at times on the small stage. There's also a larger stage, which we'll get to in the second half. So some of these images are denoised, some of them are not, so bear that in mind. The first thing I wanted to point out is that how cool is Nikon's setup, the ability to immediately trigger a zone for autofocus. For instance, in this case, I had a crowd here, and in the third row there's this dude with like corpse paint and like a pentagram on his forehead. So what'd you do? Instead of going into zone and subject detection, which will pick up any of these people as well, because he looked like the least human out of all of us, he just toggle function 1 in my case for single point autofocus and just immediately pick him out and capture him in an instant. So in terms of banding, the minute they started rolling the intro, this light came on and I could visibly see banding, which is the better situation out of most, which is where you can see banding and you can start adjusting. But I can guarantee you will not have time in certain situations to start fine-tuning frequencies. So the electronic shutter, as great as it is and as fast as it is in Nikon's 3.7 millisecond readout, sometimes you're going to have to start fine-tuning frequencies for certain lights. And it was only this weird orange tangerine looking light that caused the banding on this stage. And so you either adjust for this and then you get banding from everything else, or you hope that you capture enough scenes where this light isn't on. Next image. Pianist comes out. Same thing. See these little streaks of bacon over here? Yeah, I mean, you either go very dark silhouette shot or you try and adjust it, but yeah, I'm not gonna go through each and every individual frame. It's just part of the game with the Nikon setup. Otherwise, the images are great. They're edited to my liking. Again, you can see some banding here, even in a black and white image. So yeah, shame about it. But my favorite shot of the evening, even though the microphone is in focus, sort of her arm is in focus more than her face, but this image of Veronica, I believe her name is my favorite image of the evening, and Nikon captured it very beautifully. And this was in a scene where the actual light that caused the banding was on. I just happened to capture a moment using 20 FPS shooting mode where those lights were off. So otherwise good. I wanted to sort of give you a heads up that sometimes this is also the Sony. If you leave it in zone autofocus, there's clearly a human in the frame, but it will pick up the microphone stand. Sony did the same thing. It's weirdly annoying and oddly, one of the things Fuji was very good at is just separating those two. Missed focus here. It does happen, but with the Nikon, as I mentioned, you can quickly just go into single point autofocus and get the job done. So for photography, Nikon is absolutely delivering all of the sides. Quick shot of the band at the end. Very, very nice colors. Didn't really need to edit much, just add a little punch to it. And that's it. Move over to the main stage. Different lights. There's an LED wall behind it as well, so that's something to also keep in mind. Band comes out, good shots. Sometimes misses, so when the flames fly up, it loses it for a second, but Nikon quickly finds its way back. So otherwise, phenomenal images coming out of the Nikon. I love each and every one of them. I think for photography purpose, can't really get any better than this if they could just get around the banding and flickering. So maybe in the next iteration, if they get like a global shutter sensor, then those shouldn't be an issue. Yeah. Both Sony and Nikon are guilty of this. If you have any sort of subject detection on, for some reason, if a hand comes up, they both react to it. So there's clearly a human subject in the frame, and it just goes all over the focus point. Very good. I mean, just look at the quality of the flames, and also whoever didn't mark this spot as a big X, don't put your mic here, is guilty. Don't do that. That's really dangerous. Very good. Again, yes, sometimes missing focus. This one I turned black and white because it's least atmospheric, but yeah, banding, really annoying. Those flickering as well. You can sometimes see it, you sometimes cannot. In this scene, I couldn't see anything in the EVF. Go home, find the image like this. All right, a quick shot in DX mode, so it just gives you an APS-C crop instantly. And again, you can just toggle that using the 300 million buttons that are on the Nikon Z8. So you have myriad options available to you at your fingertips. Sony, the advantage of a mechanical shutter, and I did actually go through and do a little bit of electronic shutter shooting without any sort of fine-tuning of frequencies, and yeah, of course, as you can imagine, some banding visible there. Slightly less visible than the Nikon, I do have to say. But when you use the mechanical shutter, you get beautiful images, punchy Sony colors. I mean, these are the type of images I like to look at when I look at concert photos. You can see some banding here as well. You can see that yellowish hue there going on the main stage. But other than that, beautiful images coming out of it. Maybe to some people a little over punchy and contrasty. So to each their own. Other than that, good images all across the board. But of course, it's not invincible in terms of electronic shutter. So 10 frames a second is what you're limited to. That's enough for most concert photography situations. Now here's a mixed bag, and I'm not going to tell you which one is which, but if you know the two brands, you will actually figure out pretty quickly which one is which. So great images. Probably my favorite of the evening is this one, just because the dude is actually airborne and the scene was pretty dynamic as they tripped over each other. Good images. In terms of sports photography, the Nikon is much faster to react when subject detection is on. Sometimes maybe a little too volatile with switching subjects. So for instance, in video, I noticed that I preferred the Sony because the Sony just kept the scene in focus and smoothly racked from one person to another, whereas Nikon was just a little bit more bouncy for my liking. I set white balance on the ice, as suggested by the Ice Hockey Association's photographers. They both worked very well, and you can see the difference between the images, which I will reveal in just a second. But yeah, a little bit more bluish on the ice for the Sony, and a lot of very strong blue-white influence here. This is also a white wall. This is also a white wall. So on the Nikon, you get a lot more yellows, true to life yellows, whereas on the Sony, which I'll show you, for instance, this one was Sony, a little bit more grayish on the wall. This was a little more true to life for my liking, but overall, I think if we look at this image, I think this was the most balanced, and this was a Nikon image. This is what it mostly looked like. In terms of capturing detail, I think it's worth highlighting that both of them will get the job done. I mean, at this point, you can sort of see what's on the puck as it is being captured in flight. There's really no bad choice for both of these, but I think the ergonomics for photography is better on the Nikon, and in terms of the way it records and racks focus from one person to another and keeps up with the subjects in a presentable manner video-wise, definitely the Sony is a better choice for me. Okay, handball. Now in this venue, the manager of the venue told me, just expect the lights to be very, very bad. And in real life, they didn't look bad at all. And I think on the images, this is where the Nikon once again stands out. Sure, of course, great images, great quality as you'd expect. It does sometimes get confused if you leave it in something like zone autofocus or setting up a custom box. Both of these subjects were in the box, and yet it decided to focus on the bench in the back, even though it was actually tracking the person perfectly up until they were both in the frame, and then it back focused. So yeah, that's annoying. You can actually miss an action shot with this issue. I think this was just a good way to show you how dynamic handball is. Certainly no lack of details over here. Really can't tell you anything bad about the Nikon. Super snappy. I can leave subject detection on, whereas on the Sony I find myself switching it off because it sticks too much, which of course we all love Sony and how great the autofocus is, but yeah, just in general it can be a little bit too sticky. Very sharp. Bit of vignetting that I added in post just to highlight the subject. But overall, I can't tell you anything bad about the Nikon on this evening for sure. Now with Sony, also, again, very similar in the beginning, tracks subjects in simpler situations without any problems. Also, the minute another subject entered the frame, yeah, just focused on the back as well. So this only happened once on the Sony. It happened multiple times on the Nikon, but yeah, just keep in mind there's no perfect camera. you're gonna have issues. But in situations where the person runs up to the goalkeeper, at least it keeps the subject that I intended to photograph and keep in focus. It kept it in focus. I love this image. I love the facial expression of the other player over there. Similar situation where Nikon perfectly handled this image over here. Quick pass to the side player over here, runs in, shoots the ball. Unfortunately, in Sony's case, multiple occasions, it just failed to pick up this person. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's the contrast between the player jerseys. But yeah, in this case, it picked up the other subjects, but just not this one. It's definitely not within the minimum focus distance. Another round of who's in focus. That's sort of acceptable, but I think the focus jumped over to the defending player. But in most situations, both of these will shine, and I think this is a good image from the Sony. Person airborne, being blocked, and then they get a penalty, I think, after this one. Here I risked my safety for this shot. But yeah, she missed it, so no issues there. And then this is literally the last second of the game. And I accidentally touched the screen and ended up tracking this player, which was sort of a lucky shot for me. But yeah, no issues whatsoever if you use touch tracking, but I don't think it's very sustainable in a sports environment. So overall, both of these will get the job done. I think if you are primarily a photographer, there's no doubt in my mind that you'll prefer the Nikon. It just gets more balanced colors and the ability to switch instantly between multiple focus modes is just overpowered. It's really, really good. I love this image. I love the fact that this guy is just trapped here looking up to his mate. That's very cool. That's it. That's the handball. I also took a shot while I was recording a video for nighttime usage. Really not much of a difference between the two, I can tell you. I think this is the Sony image and this one is the Nikon, but you'll struggle to find any sort of a real life difference between these two in terms of image quality. I think it's more about the colors and more about the actual usage. So yeah, Sony, Nikon. Yeah, and that's what I guessed as well. Just simply because it's colder over here in the shadows, and I noticed that the Sony keeps the shadows a little bit warmer. In terms of video, what I found is that Sony is almost becoming the industry standard in a certain layer of media. I think it's very, very capable, very sharp, very consistent with its quality that you can hand over. With Nikon, I found that quite often when it comes to very dark scenarios or daylight where cloud cover can change the colors, I just found myself working way too much on the colors of the video when it's filmed in log. So if that's something that is a requirement, then Sony is going to be a bit better way to go. There's also just so many content creators, so many tutorials on how to deal with Sony, how to expose. But I overall found that both in terms of autofocus, the Sony was more stable, stuck to the subject when it needed to, let go when it needed to. There's just so much in their algorithm that's trained already compared to Nikon. What Nikon has on its advantages, and now they've purchased Red. And Red is a cinema company. And so a lot of the talent is going to come and work directly for Nikon. They're in the process of merging the companies or bringing Red into the Nikon group. So the future may hold something brighter for them. For now, I think the Sony is much better in terms of video. Specs wise, they're similar, but they are quite different. Both of them can deliver 4K up to 120 frames per second. 8K on the Sony, only up to 30 frames per second. That was a little bit of a disappointment, I think, from the overall community, but 8K is really not it's not the industry standard yet. So 8K is a nice bonus if you're filming something static. Of course, the rolling shutter speeds on both of them will change when you switch over to a larger resolution. But it is worth highlighting that the Nikon will go up to 8K 60 in both N-Log as well as N-RAW. But only if you are a DaVinci user can you actually work with N-RAW files. So if you're using the Adobe Suite or Final Cut, then it's something that you need to start learning if you are planning to switch over to Nikon. They both have dual native ISOs at 800 and 4000, and you can visibly see when they start cleaning up. I do wish in the future for them to have a little bit more flexibility towards going towards 12,800, but Sony has an entire cinema line for that. So if you are looking for something like the FX3, which has a second native ISO base at 12,800, then of course you can always purchase one of those bodies. And that's the thing about investing in an ecosystem, is once you start getting lenses, you need to sort of look at, do I need a second or third body? Which company will offer me more flexibility? Because currently on the Nikon side, you can get a Z8 and like a Z6 III, and those will be very capable at video, but that's about it. With Sony, you can choose so many options and so many flavors. While I was recording the EVFs for this video, I quickly realized, not having done that on Sony, is that in 2025, I think it's a bit shameful that you cannot record your EVF as well as use the actual display or EVF on your camera at the same time. You'll have to choose either disabling your screens on the body of your camera or actually outputting a clean feed, which would defeat the purpose because I would be recording nothing but what the camera is recording anyway. I really hope that Sony listens and actually patches this up. I think they have the horsepower now in their cameras and their processors. On the Nikon side of things, you can just do whatever you want. You can connect an external monitor, you can record directly onto an external device like I do, if you have your Atomos Ninja or whatever it is that you want to record the EVF, and you can choose what settings you have and what resolutions you have. So more flexibility on their side. Who would have thought? I do wish that Nikon would adapt what Sony has, but also vice versa. Hear me out on this one. The Sony cameras of recent times have two hybrid slots for storage. They have a SD and a CF Express Type A hybrid slot, two of them on most of their cameras, full frame cameras. On the Nikon side, with the Z8, unlike the Z9, you have one CF Express B card and an SD card slot. So whereas that's good because it gives you more flexibility to use a cheaper storage solution as a second solution, unfortunately it does get rid of like simultaneous or backup recordings, so you cannot actually record onto the CF Express and at the same time back up to the SD card. So that option there is eliminated. To round up this quick summary, I'm frankly torn between these two. On one hand, the Nikon is, in my opinion, a near perfect camera for photography. Uncompromised 20 FPS, 45 megapixels, beautiful colors, consistent, doesn't flicker in most situations unless you have, of course, venues where multiple frequency LEDs are present, and that sometimes happens. Or if you are recording a press event for politicians or big companies, you have an LED wall behind, that can be iffy. So the lack of a mechanical shutter will come into play 3% of the time you use this camera. You either have to deal with it and carry a second body with a mechanical shutter, or just work with fine frequencies and hope that you nail the shot either way, or that your shot can be worked afterwards in post-production. On the Sony, 10 FPS mechanical, 20 FPS or 30 FPS depending on the compressed or uncompressed state of your RAW files. Very capable. A little bit more work needed on the color science if you are planning to deliver consistent results. And on the other hand, video, which is where I make most of my money, is a different situation. I don't like the colors that I get out of Nikon. I don't like the fact that RAW is there, but RAW requires DaVinci specifically. And frankly, the rolling shutter effect increases once you use oversampling. So it's great to have oversampling, but at the expense of skewing when you're panning. And I wasn't even panning very hard, but you could see some of the shots have rolling shutter effect. And I don't necessarily like the balance between the shadows and the highlights and how they roll off. Whereas on the Sony, I think by now I'm starting to get used to the quality that you can get out of it. Sure, some of the magenta brown hues need to be fixed afterwards, but it is what it is. And it's something that you can start preparing a workflow for, and therefore get in the habit of quickly negating those problems. On the other hand, you get world-renowned autofocus, a great ecosystem of lenses, first and third party, and a community that is actually growing still, and probably the biggest video community out there is. So on the video end, most likely I would pick the Sony. the situation is I get both photography and videography requests at this point, and I can't really be choosing. I'm not in the situation to just choose what to decline and what not to decline. So I'm torn between these two, and I've got a few days as I now have to hand over these cameras and make a decision which one to purchase. Thank you for watching this video, and let me know in the comments below if you want to actually have a separate video about which one I chose. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.